During the morning. Welcome everyone for today's webinar. Reference Architecture brings high levels of maturity to your enterprise service bus, sponsored by Prosoft Technology Group. I have my Vice President, Integration Practices, Ram Kanamuri, who is the speaker and presenter today, and our Principal Architect, Arvind Katrugada, online. Without much delay, I'll start the webinar. To those of you who are not aware of Prosoft, I'll just quickly take a couple of minutes to explain who we are. We are founded in 1995, headquartered in Donesville, Illinois, and we're the fastest growing company since many years. We have the global presence. We have development and support centers at United States, Canada, and India. We are 500 associates globally. And we are partners to technology giants like SAP, Software AG, and IBM. And what we offer is the services around strategy, architecture, development, project management, and business analysis and testing. So here are some of our engagement models and the staff augmentation, where we support you with our subject matter experts and strategic outtasking, project-based engagement services, and managed services. And these are core business integration offerings. We have services Center of Excellence, which offers enterprise middleware assessment, strategy, advisory services, ESB Reference Architecture, technology agnostic solutions architecture, establishing SOA and governance. Flexible, we have flexible engagement models. The platforms we support, yes, web methods from Software AG, SAP NetWeaver API, IBM WebSphere Integration Suite, and TIBCO. And these are some of our technology agnostic core integration services in elaboration. We offer SOA complete partnership, awareness to realization, governance and Center of Excellence, ESB Reference Architecture and Strategy, and BPM solutions with BAM and executive dashboards, 24/7 middleware, infrastructure and application support services, and customer-specific on-site web methods workshops. This is what actually, when we talk about web methods, who we are partners to web methods since 1997, even before it got acquired by Software AG. We are the largest pool of web methods subject matter experts, supporting clients on web methods versions ranging from 6.x to 9.x. And we have extensive experience around assessments, enterprise integration, modernizations, upgrades, mentoring, infrastructure services, and support. And these are some of our customers and our technology partners. Having said, I'll hand it over to Ram Kanamuri. Ram?
Thank you, James. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this second series of our webinars. I think some of you might have attended last week's modernization, EI modernization webinar. So this is a second of our webinar series, and we will talk about today primarily about reference architecture in ESB domain and how and why it's needed, and how it's been formulated, and what are the success stories behind that. And we will also have, in the end, a question-answer session to be able to answer some of your questions. I'm expecting most of the audience are definitely enterprise integration, IT specialists and subject matter experts, from development up to design and engineering, and also enterprise architects and data architects who are promulgating a lot more into the EI domain, enterprise integration domain. So today I would just like to start with talking about the role of integration platforms and the need for an architecture strategy in these platforms. But before I go there, I would like to talk about the evolution of our EI domain itself. The EI domain, integration domain, or enterprise integration domain, when it is classified within the IT portfolio from Gartner, it has been always under the infrastructure domain of IT. So essentially, these are platforms that provide for IT infrastructure, not physical infrastructure, like network, but also application infrastructure, which does not pertain to core application logic, but the network, the wiring between all these applications. Now, we are familiar with B2B and EAI integration frameworks. I wouldn't want to delve too much into the history behind it, but now the ESBs are nothing but an evolution in the B2B and EAI integration frameworks, evolving more into service-oriented platforms that provide for enterprise class functionality. And we'll talk about what those functionalities are, because that's very important. And when we say we want to establish a reference architecture, we want to make sure what we are talking about, and we have to establish the boundaries of this particular domain, and then talk about the architecture. Now, talking about such boundaries, we want to make sure this enterprise integration domain involves not just the B2B and EAI that we are familiar with, but also business process modeling, also human workflow and task and case management, end-to-end monitoring and visibility across all these transactional systems, providing real-time analytics on top of those transactional systems and providing executable dashboards around them. But also SOA governance, assuming we put ourselves on a roadmap for SOA maturity. Of course, governance has to be right along with it in parallel. And we would talk about the design time and runtime governance, because in an SOA strategy and roadmap, an ESB is core and front center of it, the whole strategy. ESB does not fulfill the entire SOA maturity of an organization. All the other application domains and infrastructure domains need to participate as well, but still ESBs are the core and front of such architecture. So that's the reason we stress a lot on a need for ESB reference architecture. And we will want to talk about an evolution. We know we wanted to come away from those spaghetti point-to-point integrations that we have seen in legacy organizations to a much more organized platform like this, where an enterprise service bus solves your problem by normalizing your point-to-point integrations into much more streamlined and manageable and supportable and extendable and a lot of things. But eventually these enterprise integration platforms, or what we call now enterprise service buses, do a lot of functionality that we want to put boundaries around. So that's very important. An organization has to go through an exercise and define what we call the requirements around these middleware platforms. So we talk about the functionality, the core functions that we want to define for these platforms. Now, at this point, we should not be talking about the technology or whether it's IBM, whether it's SAP, PI, or Software AG, Web Methods platforms, or TIBCO. These are all enterprise class platforms. Every platform provides majority of the functions, the core functions that you're seeing here on this slide now. I tried to put a lot of these words out, but as you can see, the bolder they are, the bigger they are, the more importance. Sometimes they change and vary based on the organization we are in. If we are a manufacturing organization with core IT to sustain a business, a manufacturing business, or maybe we are a technology organization, so things would be different based on our organizational IT needs as well. But these are the core functions, and we have to put boundaries around them. We have to put guardrails around them. A reference architecture is those guardrails, is those guidelines. So talk about before going to the reference architecture, we won't like to talk about the maturity of an EI domain. Prosoft and I myself have been in this domain for more than 15 years, and myself have worked with a lot of organizations for more than 10 years. There are 3 or 4 other organizations that I personally been involved in laying out strategy for the maturity of the EA domains. So when we talk about maturity levels, I want to make sure these are more of my own opinion. Level 0, we don't have any EI strategy in place. There's no integration platform as such. All the interfaces are point-to-point, right? And most of the interfaces are implemented with the native technologies, like the applications extending their arms into each other. And this is homegrown, not level 0. Most organizations are beyond this. But at level 1, we have a use of an integration platform, maybe for the domains like B2B, for partner integration, maybe for FTP and file handling. And most of the integration is simple integrations using data synchronization. It does meet some enterprise needs, some needs of the integration, but not enterprise needs. And we could not reuse much of it. So there's no really any reduced total cost of ownership in the domain. But at level 2, we would have acquired an enterprise class ESB, maybe webMethods, maybe IBM, but maybe a mix of them. Maybe, a lot of organizations would have maybe Informatica along with it to fulfill the EI domain needs. So these are we have an enterprise class ESB in place. It meets all our integration needs, and the governance and the design is not optimal. We did not realize the reuse yet. We did not see the reduced TCO yet. So we need, this level or at this maturity, over a period of time, like within 3-4 years, we will see, the environments become unsupportable. Why you would see them become unsupportable is an EI domain, an ESB domain, or a middleware domain is not unlike an application platform. Is an ever-growing domain. It grows 30, 40, 50% per year. That means in every 2 years it might become double the capacity in the things that it does for the enterprise. So in that aspect, in 4 years you will have hundreds of integrations that you need to sustain and support at runtime. And if they are not consistent in the way they've been designed and implemented, your supportability in operations becomes unsustainable, and you will not realize any more reduction in your total cost of ownership. So that's when at level 3, what we see is to establish a reference architecture where we normalize the patterns that have been established in the domain. We put into place a rapid time to market SDLC based on those proven patterns and repeated design and development of those components that enable those patterns, and also establish a stable support environment for people and process with the governance in place, and also adding on to more value-add solutions on top of the CI domain, like BPM, like BAM, and maybe in the future dashboards and analytics, and maybe even in-memory-based analytics with Terracotta kind of platforms. And at the highest levels of maturity, we have seen 100% available multi-site high available environments being built on these enterprise class EI domains in very large organizations. And some enterprises even started terming the word everywhere. EI is more now like a net that you spread across all your applications. And even it spreads into your cloud, enabling your cloud integration with cloud streams kind of solutions. So now, going back to our need for reference architecture. So what is reference architecture? I don't want to go into definitions at this time, but I know to make it short, I will present and share this presentation with you. But to talk about an enterprise service bus, as a definition, is an architectural pattern that helps organizations implement and service-oriented architecture between systems. Definitely, people might have been aware of, establishing a center of excellence. So, primary objective of any group that is termed as a center of excellence is to create a reference architecture. And this reference architecture is the tools that will be used by the approval groups in your governance policies and governance procedures. And that's what we will talk about, is why we need a reference architecture. Is definitely your reference architecture forms a strong foundation for your SOA adoption in the enterprise, not just for the ESB, not just for the middleware, but also for your application development, for them to be SOA enabled, to be participant in an SOA enabled enterprise. So integration problems can be solved in several different ways. It is important to solve them using established patterns. So that's another important aspect that I talked about earlier, is establish consistent patterns and limited set of patterns. And that's the goal of the reference architecture. And again, reference architecture is a design, just like any design for any application development. It's a design for an ESB. And without such design, the need for such design is very important. And what do we do? When we say ESB reference architecture? What should it do? What should the reference architecture do? So the goals for the reference architecture is to lay down a ESB strategy and a roadmap. So we talked about the maturity levels. It can't happen overnight. We have to lay out a roadmap for ourselves. So create the architecture to in those roadmap and direction, and provide guidelines for the architecture. So we lay down governance procedures and policies. We establish deployment architecture. I'll talk about in detail what deployment architecture is. We also establish software architecture, how we develop various specific components, including their input-output signatures, the reuse of the signature level and the data level. All that detail is the software architecture. Then also establish a rapid time to market. So not only laying out the architecture, but those architectural components within those patterns have to be set up in a proven time to market, reduced time to market in the SDLC, in the life cycle of development for any organization. And eventually to reduce the TCO. That's the goal of the reference architecture services. Now let's go in detail and see what else these reference architecture can actually contain, important artifacts of reference architecture. Essentially, we have we have established our own guidelines and principles, but these are at a high level. What we call these are differently what we can consider as individual documents. At a high level, we have the reference architecture guideline. This is a high-level document that provides an overview of the ESB domain. So for any executive level or analyst level people, they take this document to get a perspective of what ESB is about. The ESB deployment architecture talks about the physical and the logical architecture, say from the high availability perspective, the clustering, and the number of virtual machines, number of capacity and sizing, all that physical architecture, as well as the component architecture. Like, will we have messaging inbuilt? Will we have B2B components separated? Will we have governance in place? All those are the aspects of separate components of the ESB that you have to consider, and their orientation and their availability and scalability are considered into this architecture. The software architecture is the detailed document that establishes the integration patterns. Just like application design, this is the ESB design. So design patterns for each paradigm, for like SOA, what are the design paradigms for BPM, separate patterns. So B2B, separate patterns. All these are various areas that we've got to establish patterns, and not all organizations might accomplish all in one go. but our maturity roadmap will define what we will elaborate and what we will accomplish in various stages of our reference architecture. And some of the other important artifacts include a strategy, as I said, an implementation roadmap. We also include the requirements, the ESB requirements. Remember I showed you the big bubbles. A lot of the functionality of the ESB has to be guardrailed with these requirements and capabilities guidelines. So these guidelines are the norms for architects and designers for every project that's come by in the next few years to use these guidelines on what the role and responsibility of an ESB is when it is compared with the application's responsibility in an enterprise. And also lay out an SOA governance guide. That's the role of the reference architecture as well. You know, SOA and SOA governance is a big animal in itself. And we have another webinar coming up next week. Samir is who's an expert on an SOA governance, will talk a lot about the governance policies, the asset lifecycle models, you know, approval points and groups. All these are pertaining to first getting it right from the organization, people, processes, and tools before we go into what we call actual implementation on a platform like Centroside. These are the more important artifacts of the reference architecture, is to lay out the roadmap and lay out all these guidelines. And not to forget also other artifacts that come out of reference architecture include development handbook, you know, all the naming conventions, best practices handbooks, you know, common frameworks. That's another important aspect. You know, establish common frameworks for your ESB, and they've been you know, established frameworks and established usage of those frameworks, including configuration, logging, error handling, escalation as well, and supportability. Those are all the frameworks that we have to be documented and architected and referred as well, and including schema design standards, especially in an SOA roadmap. Now, the service design, the visual standards, the visual naming conventions, the accessibility patterns, those are very crucial, and those are the design standards that we would have established in this handbook, SOA Service and Service Design Handbook. Also, important things are from the project management perspective. We also need to establish the gaps in maturity report and the IT skills assessment for the PMO office to be able to you know, assess your integration efforts that come through with this architecture in place. Also, not to forget the troubleshooting and support guide for the operations and runtime of your integration domain. So how do they establish this reference architecture? Definitely, we need to think about the people who would do this, right? We talked about a COE, a Center of Excellence, or sometimes people call it as a competency center. Whatever it is, typically it is the responsibility of an enterprise architecture domain, and enterprise architects formulate a need for a reference architecture in ESB domain as well. We definitely need a business sponsor to sponsor for this effort, and an IT executive sponsor. But primarily, the effort will be headed by enterprise architects and integration architects. And the participants would be business analysts, business process architects, all system architects from the application development teams, and also infrastructure architects and data architects are participants of this reference architecture effort and formulation. Typically, these documents you know, few weeks or many weeks, depending on what we want to achieve. But the typical process that you need to take is a 5-step process that we have seen been very successful. First, define the requirements of what your ESB is going to do for your enterprise. Not only for your ESB, but also for your applications on how they will behave in an enterprise with an enterprise level bus and a mature status. Now, after we define the requirements of the ESB, we go through and analyze the existing platform and perform gap analysis on how to cover our gaps in the existing platform or re-platform, or depending on our maturity level, we will lay out a gap, perform a gap analysis and lay out a roadmap. And then with that roadmap, we assess the IT skills, the organizational strategy, because eventually any ESB strategy has to be in line with the enterprise architecture strategy as well, IT organizational strategy as well, and IT governance procedures as well. So these need to be aligned. The ESB's internal SDLC has to be aligned with the IT organizational SDLC. So that's the third stage. That's what we would do. The fourth one is the evaluation and recommendations phase. This is where all the architects sit together after all the gap analysis is come about. We start formulating strategy workshops to articulate and produce recommendations from evaluation of the existing IT platforms that are fulfilling the EI domain to establishing a reference architecture, and finally defining the reference architecture and software architecture as described earlier. Now, I would want to talk about a little bit on how we do the requirements, the first step. We have to definitely look at the customer view, the business view, and the IT view of our organization, because eventually you would think EI and enterprise integration domain, which is a middleware or ESB domain, is just a transportation layer. But we have seen in our maturity models, it is not just a transportation layer. It does add a lot more value in knowing the aspect of the view of the business as well. So it is very important from when we define the requirements of ESB, we take a good view of our business and IT and define the scenarios around them. And there are more than 250 unique requirements that we'll have to undergo through to perform those requirement sessions. Eventually, these requirements will provide you with an articulated session to your next step is to analyze those existing requirements and perform the gap analysis. In analyzing existing tools and integration, we use a methodology to define the gaps to be filled, and then to define the components that can be leveraged for fulfilling those gaps. Ideally, what would it mean is, as an example, if we have identified in a B2B kind of a scenario that we have an old legacy platform that is fulfilling FTP-based or WAN-based integration, and all the transformation is handled by the legacy platforms. So there is not essentially only a connectivity kind of a supported platform existing in the environment today, and the gap analysis would say we would want to go for an enterprise class platform. And the defined components for that would be to, say, implement trading networks, web methods trading networks for fulfilling that gap. And inputs into that ESB would be to define all the requirements around the functionality of partner integration and partner connectivity and partner management. And not only that, but also providing a flexible solution that provides rapid partner onboarding and rapid, performing rapid mapping and translation and transformation services as well to our backend systems. Because eventually our backend systems are also evolving. A lot of platforms would be moving into ERP-based platforms or cloud-based platforms. Your middleware layer is the backbone that will provide and enable those replatforming and migration of other domains within the enterprise. So these are crucial analysis that we would do, and those provide inputs into the design our infrastructure and the logical architecture of our ESB. Step 3, as I said, we perform and assess existing technology toolset and their capabilities, examine and development standards, guidelines, and implementation methodologies. We also assess the current IT skills, existing IT skill set, and identify training needs, if any, within the enterprise and within the organizational IT organization. We also assess enterprise vision and roadmap. Essentially, as I said, we want to align the ESB roadmap along with the enterprise roadmap. So eventually here in this stage, the deliverable will be to provide an assessment report and expert recommendations with the panel. Step 5 and 4 is pretty much where majority of our deliverables come out, the architectural deliverables that I talked about earlier. All the development, evaluation, and assessment and viability of various products, assessment of various components within each product suite, all those come out here, and the reference architecture deliverables, including the ESB reference architecture, the deployment architecture, the logical component software architecture, all the mediation patterns, reusable frameworks, governance guidelines, and the roadmap for those implementation are the deliverables of these aspects. A typical timeline that we should establish for such a reference architecture is, about, I would say, 10 to 12 weeks for the COE, as I've seen achievable timeline for most organizations. Again, we don't want to drag on this architecture exercise because we don't want to spend too much time on it as well. So compressing it into a shorter time, allocating resources to participate in these workshops, maybe even 3 to 4 hours per day is what we have seen become very effective in establishing such an architecture. But long term, we definitely have to sustain that architecture as well. So there is a continuous annual reviews once we establish the architecture to go back and put in the lessons learned from the architecture into the SDLC as well. Now, some of the considerations, I think I have another 5 minutes. I would like to just give a little bit more detail on how some of the considerations, these workshops or the sessions that we should conduct between these COE panelists and architects, and their considerations should be very important. And I'll take the last few minutes to go through them before I'll open it up for question and answers. So let's go into some of the details. Some of the integration pattern strategy sessions is to typically establish, adopt, and define various integration patterns, and these are some of the few that I could talk about. Synchronous request response, asynchronous request response, different publish and subscribe patterns, mediation, and virtualization. Especially when we have runtime governance strategy in place, how we would perform that virtualization and what are the components that we will use for mediation. It doesn't really, should not matter which technology we would use, whether it's mediator or whether it's data power or even layer 7. There are multiple technologies that can enable. We need to know what our requirements are and on what our capabilities need to be to establish those integration patterns. But data aggregation, guaranteed delivery, and retry and reprocessing, I know are core functionalities of EAI and BB. But web services and so forth as REST, all these are arguments that we define during the integration patterns strategy sessions. Also important is to establish sessions and strategy sessions for canonical modeling and entity modeling. This is on the data design side. we need to have business analysts. I think I talked about business analysts being part of the domain and panelists for establishing this architecture. They provide the perspective of various entities within our composition model. Even for example, when we establish SOA patterns or SOA maturity patterns, we would start with low-level, application-level services, which we would classify as application-level services. When ESBs mediate those services or re-implement those services with additional wrappers for security, for enterprise class modeling of those low-level services into what we call entity-level services, is the guidelines that we would establish in these documents, these data modeling documents. We would examine the suitability of these with various industries. Now, entity modeling is not same for any organization. These entity models depend purely on the business that the organization is sustaining and the kind of entities that the ESB will deal with. For example, an energy company or a utilities company would have entities related to metadata management, like yours. It would have entities related to plant maintenance, maybe related to turbines and their life cycle. But at the same time, if you're talking about an organization that's a retail organization like J.Crew, they would have entities like customer, a store, an item, and vendors. So those are the entities that we are talking about. Now, when we have the modeling of these entities into canonical objects, the SOA maturity is purely and definitely dependent on these maturity of this modeling. And establish and define the document guidelines using entity objects for service orientation is crucial in this approach. And schema designs for these entities, naming rules and visuals for XSPs and the namespaces, especially the taxonomy that we would use for these business entities, is also very important because they will tie back into your governance aspect as well. Also establish a canonical and entity modeling strategy for ESB PubSub. A lot of your ESB header requirements are essentially when ESB is performing as a messaging bus, high-speed messaging for a lot of organizations. Even on the mobile side, we have seen with the evolution of Internet of Things in utility organizations, we have seen a tremendous spike in the messaging side of the ESBs, where we have to handle millions of transactions per hour, especially when the smart grid implementations have to come into picture. The messaging the throughputs are extreme. So these are some of the considerations in the entity modeling as well that we would look at as the fault requirements and fault structuring of these messaging is very crucial in the reuse and flexibility in our architecture. Also, establish best practices. That's the important aspect, and when we create the artifacts like best practices documentations and guidelines documentations for the ESB development, especially the error handling, logging, notification, all these frameworks have to be designed and documented and how to be used in subsequent implementations and integration projects. That's very crucial step that we have to take care, and majority of our effort in establishing architecture would concentrate on these establishing the best practices in ESB component development. And to just leave at this point with a few notes, Prosoft has been very instrumental in establishing such reference architecture and realizing the benefits of it with multiple organizations and have very successful past implementations in the last I would say 8 to 9 years. We have really matured in our offerings in the enterprise integration domain. Of course, add to above, legacy modernization services and e-commerce and mobile platforms have been big as well. And upcoming, we have next week is SOA governance webinar. At this time, I would like to open up the session for Q&A. So, James, would you be able to take it back and open it up, please?
Thanks, Ram. Thanks, everybody. And now we're open for any of your questions. There is a question and answer question tab in your GoToMeeting window, right-hand side corner. So you can place all your questions there. Once again, there is actually in your window, GoToMeeting window, there is a questions tab. You can type in all your questions or queries there. To those actually who placed request for copy of the presentation, yes, we'll be sending out a thanks note along with the details how you can obtain the copy of the presentation, and even we share the link to watch the recorded session. Okay, with that, thank you so much for your time this morning. We look forward for your participation in our next week's webinar on SOA governance. I'll be sending out more details through the thanks note. You can place any of your questions. You can reply to the thanks note, and you can place any of your questions there. We'll be glad to address them. And once again, thank you so much. I look forward to see you next Wednesday, same time. Thank you.